Hello, I'm Harvey Ambrose, and I'm preaching this message today on behalf of the Missionary Baptist Voice of Africa radio station in Monrovia, Liberia. They're having difficulties with their equipment, so they've asked me to pre-record these and post them on YouTube so that they can play them to you there in Liberia at the appointed time, typically 8 p.m. Sunday evening. Please pray for me as I try to bring this message, which is found in Genesis chapter 13. And I will begin reading in verse 1. Genesis 13, verse 1, which reads, And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the south, even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents, and the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was so great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelleth then in the land. And Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and behold, all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched tent towards Sodom. The men of Sodom were wicked, and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. I'll end the reading there and try to discuss this passage. The last sermon from chapter 12 had to do with Abraham going into Egypt because there had been a great famine in the land of Canaan, and he had people with him, and he had to subsist. And I found nothing in the Bible that would suggest that Abram was at fault in going to Egypt, but he was at fault when he lied to the Egyptians about his wife Sarah, and having her and bringing her into that lie by having her claim to be his sister, when in fact she was a half-sister. So it was a half lie, but which is the same as a full lie. And because of this, she was taken into Pharaoh's house, perhaps into his bed, we don't know. Abram became very rich while in Egypt because the Pharaoh seemed to have lavished gifts upon him on account of what Pharaoh thought was his sister, Sarai at this time. But the end result of that, of course, regardless of the riches that he had accumulated, he always had on his mind that he had basically sold his wife to Pharaoh for whatever donkeys he got, or cattle, or whatever riches Pharaoh sent his way. I'm sure that Sarai was not happy about it either, and I'm convinced the Lord hates a lie. But not meaning to preach that, they came up out of Egypt when Pharaoh learned about it, he sent them out of the land, and they had to go back from the southern area there up north, and he eventually went back. In fact, fairly directly. Abram went back to the place where he first settled there, which was between Bethel, what later became Bethel, and Hai. Now, they use these terms, Bethel, which it wasn't named that at the time. They're what we would call an anachronism in the Bible. It was written to people who knew where Bethel was, and so to explain where Abraham lived, Moses wrote in terms that those people understood the place names. It was later called that. But anyway, between Bethel and Hai, which was at the base of the mountains, and he dwelt there, and it says that he went to the altar that he had first made there. Abraham was building altars and praying to God as he sojourned in the land of promise, in the land of Canaan. But when he gets back, it says he called upon the name of the Lord. Now, there's nothing wrong at any time. In fact, it's a thing to do to call upon God, to pray to God and to seek out God. It's the duty of man to please God, and God is pleased with sincere hearts that sincerely pray to him, regardless of the occasion. I take myself to task pretty often because I'm not good at prayer. I'm very, very weak in that regard. I don't pray often as I should. I don't pray as diligently as I should. I read everywhere that true people of God are praying people. I don't doubt that. I take it to heart and understand that is a great failing on my part. I do pray. Otherwise, I could never preach. But I don't pray as I should. And those of you hearing this might also take it to heart. If you're also of that behavior in which you don't pray like you ought to. And we're told to look to Abraham, in Isaiah. It says, look into, Abraham, look into the rock from which you're hewn, into the hole of the pit from which you are digged. Look to Abraham, your father. And we're using him as an example of how those of us who seek after righteousness and those who seek the Lord, these are the good things and the bad things about the life of Abraham. Why was he calling upon the Lord at this time? I think it's because it was his habit to do so. But I'll also say this. When you make a mistake, when you're the Lord's man or the Lord's woman and you have fallen into a snare of Satan, like Abram at that time, when he lied about his wife and caused the Lord to be angry, no doubt with him, certainly with Sarai as well, because she agreed to it, but also at the Egyptians and Pharaoh, who were ignorant of all this, but because of the circumstances, God plagued them. And it didn't say that the famine had ended up in Canaan. They left Egypt not because the famine had ended, but because Pharaoh kicked them out. It's a scorn, it's a shame for the worldling, if you will, the person who worships false gods, the one who knows nothing about the true God. For him to be more righteous in his behavior than the man of God, Abram. That's a very bad turn of events. Doubtless it was on Abram's conscience. He traveled back up to Bethel, which he had left to go into Egypt, and after being put to shame by Pharaoh, and also having been made rich, which I'm sure was not his intention, but it was a consequence, and it became a burden, which we'll talk about, Lord willing. This trip to Egypt cost Abram a lot, even though he got rich from it. We don't know how rich he was to start with. But in any case, he came out much the richer for having been in Egypt. We'll see whether or not that turns out to be of benefit to him. But when you're humbled by being brought face to face with your sin, that's a good reason to call upon the name of the Lord. We don't read that he offered there at the altar. He may or he may not have. But he called upon God. And we don't read that God answered at that time. That doesn't mean he didn't, but I have a feeling that he didn't. Sometimes when we've gone off into sin and we are ashamed of that and we seek the forgiveness of God, it may be a while before you hear back from God. Or maybe not. It depends upon your prayer, I guess, upon your heart, what state that's in. But anyway, I'm not getting very far with this. I'm going to try to preach it. It seems like there's not much here, but I think there's quite a bit here if we can just get our minds around it, if I can talk about it like I should. So, again, the most direct result of Abram's sin of lying about his wife was that he became extremely wealthy. And apparently Lot did too. Lot was Abram's nephew. Abram's father, Lot's father, Haran, was Abram's brother, and he died in Ur of the Chaldees before the Lord called Abram to go into the land of Canaan. So Lot, being Abram's nephew, Abram thought of him as a brother, almost like a replacement for the brother he had lost. They were very, very close. When God told Abram to leave his family and out of his father's house and out of the country that he came from and go to another place, he took them all with him. He didn't do what God said. And then when his father Terah died in Haran, Abram proceeds on to Canaan, where he should have gone in the first place, and Lot still goes with him, which was still a violation of what God had told him to do. He was supposed to separate himself from his father's house and all the people there. He had not done it yet. They go into Egypt. He's still not done it. They get back up to Bethel. And this is when he calls upon the name of the Lord again. And subsequent to that, he becomes aware of a situation in which his servants, the people herding his cattle, and Lot's servants, the ones herding his cattle, are having a dispute, or maybe a series of disputes over land, over grazing land, no doubt. That's a fairly common issue between people who graze in open range, which is becoming less and less possible in this country, but there's still some open range here. And people fight over that. And these people fought over that. And by extension, the people whose servants they were, respectively Abram and Lot, were beginning to have a strife such that Abram decided to address it. And so he goes to Lot and he says, let there be no strife. I pray thee, between me and thee, between my herdsmen and thy herdmen, for we are brethren. So the one to initiate a remedy for the problem was Abram. Abram was the one that God called to go into the land. Abram was the one who had a promise that he was going to be given a land and that he would be made into a great nation. Lot, from what we can see in the scripture, wasn't promised even a part of what Abram was promised. Not anything at all. I don't mean to be harsh. I just don't find anything in here saying that Lot was given any promises of land or a progeny or anything from God. Doesn't mean he wasn't, but it's not in the Bible. So when Abram proposes a settlement, it means to end a dispute and prevent strife between people who had been like brothers to each other. They were uncle and nephew, very close, always been. They were inseparable, it would seem, until they got rich. But now they got rich, and that's a burden to them. I seldom do this, but maybe I should more often, given how hard it is for me to preach this. But I'm going to read something that Brother Matthew Henry wrote several hundred years ago concerning riches and concerning these two people. Speaking about Abram, it says he was very rich. And he said that the Hebrew word signifies that Abram was very heavy. You know, heavy is heavy laden with riches. It says, because riches are a burden, and those who will be rich, but do load themselves with thick clay, according to Habakkuk 2:6. Henry goes on to, Matthew Henry says, there is a burden of care in getting them, meaning riches. There's a fear in keeping them, temptation in using them, guilt in abusing them, sorrow in losing them, and a burden of account at last to be given up concerning them. Great possessions do but make men heavy and unwieldy. Abram was not only rich in faith and good works and in the promises of God, but he was rich in cattle and in silver and in gold. Now he goes on to say that God gives some of his people riches. And it's not a sin to be rich. But it is a burden to be rich. There's no doubt about that. All the things that Henry writes there, they're very accurate. When my wife and I married, this is just an aside, but maybe it's worth saying. 47 years ago, we didn't have a thing. I mean, essentially, we had the clothes on our back, and I'd taken out a loan and bought a vehicle. That was it. We had no house. We didn't even have an apartment because right after we married, I needed to move across the country. We moved in the back of a pickup truck is all we had. And it was some of the happiest days of our life when we had absolutely nothing. When I had to put a very small set of tools on layaway at Sears and Roebuck because they cost $35 and it took me 3 months to pay off a $35 investment. And yet we were happy. Nowadays, by comparison, I won't say in any real terms, but certainly in comparative terms to then, I am rich. I mean, just have everything and more, way more than I need to have. And it's a burden. You worry about those things. You worry about things that you have that you don't use, and how are you going to get those things from one place to another? You find things that you've forgotten about, and you still keep them even though you hadn't thought about them in years, just because they're yours. And at some point you acquired them, and it meant something to you at one time. It's a bit of insanity to take pleasure in possessions. And to have possessions is exactly as Matthew Henry described so eloquently in that reading. Everything about them becomes burdensome, from acquiring them to giving an account before God for how you used them. They're all a burden, without which you would probably be happier. Now, people listening to this, some of you are poor, and some of you are rich, and some of you are neither. Being poor does not help you out of the burdens of being rich, because you're still wanting to acquire them, perhaps. Being rich puts you in the wrong position too. I don't know what to say about it further other than it's a vexation of spirit. And whereas Abram and Lot had been inseparable until they became rich, once they were both rich, they had to separate. And decisions had to be made. According to the text, the land was unable to bear them both. Abraham came up with a solution of how to fix that problem, which was entirely selfless, meaning he looked not to his own needs, but to the needs of his nephew Lot. He said, look around. The whole land is available. Separate from me. You go one way, I'll go the other. Makes no difference which way you choose. I'll go the opposite way. I want you to have what you want. I want you to pick what suits you. Now, Lot did that. He picked what suited him, which was nothing more than what Abraham or Abram had offered him. But it wasn't necessarily the only thing that he could have done. Just because Abram said, the land cannot bear the both of us, and our herdmen are starting to fight each other, and let's not have strife, let's be peacemakers. Abraham may have been close enough to God to understand that God blesses the peacemakers and brings some punishment upon those who strive when they should not. Lot could have just said, Uncle Abram, you've been good to me. Ever since my father died, you took me into your house as though I were your own son. You've treated me like a son. You've allowed me to go on this trip, this sojourn, which God called you alone to do, and yet you've let me tag along. I tagged along with you to Egypt, and I've come out rich. But everything I have, every last thing I have in this world, Uncle Abram, I got from you. Take it back. Just take it all. Take all the cattle and all the servants. Make them all yours again so that we can dwell together as brethren. That's how little these possessions mean to me. Wouldn't that have been a wonderful thing? Wouldn't that have been something a lot easier to preach about than what we have here? Had Lot been so selfless, like Abram had been, just take whatever, Lot, and go your way, and that way we won't fight. Because to Abram, these things really did mean nothing. They were, at the very least, a reminder, a constant reminder to Abram that he had gotten much of that wealth since he took payment, would you say it like it is, by prostituting his wife to Pharaoh. What a hard thing to forget when you're looking at the very gold and silver and servants and cattle that Pharaoh had given you in exchange for your wife, and you're looking at those and you're remembering what you've done. It's hard to get your sins completely behind you. Now, with God and His forgiveness, we are assured that He has separated those from us as far as the east is from the west. Yet they remain in our memory, in our conscience, and it shames us. He assures us that they're forgiven, and I believe that. I have felt the forgiveness of God in my heart. Nevertheless, it's a shame to remember the things once done when we were lost and without the Lord. I don't think these things meant much to Abram. I don't think Lot taking the better part bothered Abram at all. Now, a lot of people do. They think that Abram became very upset when Lot chose the watered plains of the South Jordan River, the cities of the plain where it seemed like everything grew just automatically, rich and well-watered and no doubt productive of much food, the easy life. Whereas Abram dwelt in Canaan, in a more desert land, mountainous, hard land. But it didn't bother Abram. I'm sure of this because when we turn to, people today still talk about the land that Abram got, the land that was promised to him, of how important it is that all these promises be kept. If you read carefully the book of Joshua, it is attested by Joshua to the Israelites that every single promise that God had made to them and to their fathers God had fulfilled by that time. Now, and they all agreed to that. There are not land promises left that were not fulfilled. Either that or Scripture's wrong. It was fully fulfilled. And it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It certainly didn't matter to Abraham. And if we're looking to Abraham to see how we ought to think, how we ought to do, those of us who seek after righteousness and seek after the Lord. I'll just read this from Hebrews chapter 11, talking about Abram and those with him. It says, these died in faith, not having received the promises. Abraham didn't get them in his lifetime, but having seen them afar. If he died, how did he see them? How did he see that which did not exist yet? Have you ever asked yourself that question? He died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, as though they had tangibility to him, and confessed, talking about him and Sarah, confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. See, he was on the earth, he was in the earth, but he was not of the earth. He was of another place, and what he sought in life was another world, a completely different, I don't know what to call it. It's a world that, as far as I know, does not yet exist. A new world that we read in the Bible God will make for his people. A place, a planet, and heavens above it, all new, in which dwells nothing but righteousness and righteous people. People made righteous by God and kept righteous by God. A place where strife never exists again, where envy cannot dwell, where death cannot be found, where light comes from God himself, and the people in that place worship God in his temple, which is, he himself is the temple of the place. I have not seen it, but yet in my heart, even I, as weak as I am in prayer and in faith, I also embrace it. Embrace it with all my heart. And in comparison to that place, this place is nothing. Nothing. It's not because of the physical riches there, and there will be those. But they won't mean a thing to people whose principal inheritance is God himself. Heirs of God, jointly heirs with Christ. We have all things, the Bible tells us. Which is why it's so frustrating when in our weakness sometimes we consider possessions here on this earth. If you want to be like Abraham, you need to have a healthy regard for, an interest in, an embracing of a world to come that you cannot see with your eyes, that you can only read some cryptic language about in the Bible. But he reveals it to your heart through the Spirit the deep things of God, in which that new world is one of them. These died in faith, it says, talking about Abraham and Sarah, not having seen the promises, not having received them, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed. We're just pilgrims and strangers in this world. We don't even belong here. We don't even want to be here. We want to be in that other world. But God has seen fit that we remain here for some period of time. Therefore, we remain, but not necessarily happy. He goes on, he says, for those that say such things, they declare plainly that they seek a country, the new world. They seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, meaning Ur, the Chaldees, I guess, they might have had opportunity to have returned. Abraham could have gone back. Now, he would have been doing something that would have made God angry or disappointed at the very least. But he could have gone. But he had no interest in that, nor an interest in staying where he was. It says what he wanted in verse 16 of Hebrews 11. Abram, it says, he desired a better country, that is, a heavenly country. Wherefore, because, so in other words, because he desired that which cannot be seen with the eye yet, because it does not, as far as I know, exist yet, but being persuaded in his heart of it and embracing it, because he was that way. It says, God is not ashamed to be called Abram's God. It says, and it includes all who have such things, to be called their God. For he hath prepared for them a city. These are people that like the country. And it'll be a country. They're seeking for a country, but they live in a city. It's like country living in a city. It's a big city. I don't know much about that, but I know it'll be perfect. It will be. How do you explain spiritual blessings to people who don't have them? Some of you don't have them. You don't know what I'm talking about. But I have been blessed in my heart by God, and it's happened. It's happening now as I speak. And I would not trade a second of that. Not one moment of the Spirit of God in my heart. I wouldn't trade a moment of that for all that this world has, because it's precious. And I believe in that world to come, we will be blessed of God like that, and above that even, continually. It will be ecstasy all the time. Joy, in the Bible it says joy unspeakable and full of glory. Why would Abraham care about a piece of dirt in the Middle East? He didn't care about it at the time, except for it was a place where God told him to go, and he cared about God. He cared about pleasing God. And he suffered in this world whatever he had to suffer in order to please God. And yet people still talk about unfulfilled promises. When Lazarus the beggar died, he went to a place that the Bible called Abraham's bosom. He was there with Abraham in a place, not yet physical, but will be, that is a paradise. Abram has no complaints. He's looking forward to the consummation of all things, to the resurrection of his flesh, being brought up from the cave of Machpelah, in which he has been for nearly 4,000 years, with his beloved wife, Sarah. Not that they'll be married there, but They'll know each other. They'll love each other more than ever, because love is the ruling principle of that world to come. Getting back to our text. Sorry. But it says there was strife. Riches brought on strife. Lot could have subjugated himself. He could have loved Abram so much that he would have said, I'll have none of it. Uncle Abraham, take it all, but let me have you in my family, because I don't want to go anywhere without you. I wish that he had. Because Lot's life after this incident just went downhill rapidly. Now we read in 2 Peter, we don't want to speak too harshly of Lot. Lot would be an example of a saved person who made some wrong choices, and we all do that. We all do. But because we made a wrong choice doesn't mean that we're not saved. If we're saved, we're saved. But I want you to hear what Peter talks about. I think it's in 2 Peter. If I can find it. Sorry. Yeah, here it is. 2 Peter chapter 2. Talks about God, and he says in verse 6, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that after should live ungodly. Think about that, you Sodomites listening to that. He says, and he delivered just Lot. Now, does that mean only Lot? No, because Lot and his 2 daughters were delivered. His wife was turned to a pillar of salt for looking back, but there was 3. So by just here, it doesn't mean only Lot. It means he was justified. He was a just man. It says, and he delivered just Lot, who was vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. For that righteous man, he's declared righteous in the Bible. Lot was righteous. Lot had been saved. He was just. He was a justified person. God justified him on account of Christ having been put to death for him, and Lot having been saved by him. He delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the lifestyles of the Sodomites. It says, for that righteous man dwelling among them, and seeing and hearing what they did, it vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. So Lot was saved. But by choosing the well-watered plains of the cities of the plains, watered by the river Jordan, he lost his family. He lost his wife. He had children with his own daughter. And the offspring, he was made drunk by his daughters. He wouldn't have done it, I don't believe. He may not have even gotten drunk had it not been for the bad things that happened to him in Sodom and on leaving Sodom. But the offspring of those daughters became the sworn enemies of the descendants of Abraham. Isn't that something? People who had been close like brothers, and they were uncle and nephew, tagged along all that. Riches brought them to a point of separation. And Lot, having chosen the better part that was visible to his eyes, thinking that life would be easy and his riches would serve him well in a rich land, well-watered, easy life. Well, easy lives are not always the best way to go. We don't need to seek for trouble, but we shouldn't shun it when the Lord sends it our way. Poor Lot. He's like a lot of us who have been saved. We make wrong decisions. We take the easy path sometimes. We don't do what the Lord wants us to do or what he makes clear to us that we should do. We dabble around. We hang around the world. When he says, come out from among them and be ye separate, yet we hang around their filth. and in their cities, and we become, rather than something that helps those people, we become more and more like them. And the next thing you know, we're dwelling amongst a bunch of sodomites, which this whole nation's becoming. But here we are, we're rich. We're Americans. We've got everything. And we got all the burden and heaviness that riches bring without. Worries over things that if we didn't have them, it wouldn't hurt us a bit. We'd be better off without them. And yet, being made so stingy by them, we can't separate ourselves from it. It's a vexation of spirit. Solomon, the richest man on earth, said, all they do is vex me. There's no pleasure in them anymore. In fact, he reached the point where he says, there is no pleasure in anything. Everything under the sun is futility and vexation of spirit. This is what happens to a person that gets everything. Now, in the world to come, we'll have everything, but we will be equipped for it. Resurrected bodies, incorruptible bodies, bodies that will never sin again. We will be able to bear the glory and the riches of the world to come. But in here, still encased in sinful flesh, we succumb to it. It vexes us. We are not helped by it, but rather made worse by it. America used to be a great nation when it was poor. It isn't just people, it's nations also. We were poor and hardworking people. We were nothing in the world. We started from nothing. And we overthrew a king and because we wanted freedom or something. And, and we were poor and God blessed us. And now we're rich. And I'm just waiting for the hammer to fall on this country because we can't act like Sodom without expecting to be treated like Sodom. I'm talking as though I'm assuming you know what I'm talking about. God shortly sends fire from heaven and miserably destroys all the cities of the plain where Lot had chosen to live. He sends an angel out there to get him out before he destroys them. That's another story from another text. Even before that, Sodom is raided by some kings from the east and taken prisoner, taken captive. Abraham has to go save them. Nothing good happened to Lot once he made the wrong decision and pitched tent towards Sodom. No doubt, knowing that it was full with sinners. It says this right here. It says, but the men, he pitched tent towards Sodom, Lot did, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord, meaning right in front of his face. They were unashamed. They did whatever they did, and they didn't care if God saw it or not. That's what before the Lord means, right in front of him. And it says, exceedingly. We got a bunch of people like that in this country. I don't know what you got there in Liberia, but I don't know if it could be any worse than what we got going on right here. There will come a recompense for this lifestyle. Very likely it'll be very sudden, just like it was sudden when he destroyed Sodom. Everything was just fine. All of a sudden, fire and brimstone. And now, instead of a well-watered plain, it's the lowest place on the surface of the world. The Dead Sea, it's called. It was blasted so much by God from heaven that it burned out a pit in the earth, and the Jordan River flows into that and dies there. It evaporates. It's so hot. It's so low. It just all evaporates. The whole river evaporates and turns very salty because God's judgment against those cities. I'll end it at that point. It's a sad story of the two of them separating, and it's going to be picked up in future. In fact, the very next chapter talks about Lot's captivity. But before we get that, we've still got verses 14 through 18, which are a blessing. So, Lord willing, we'll talk about that next week. God bless you. Bye-bye.